Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot, and today we're going to be doing an investigation into the Kennedy assassination to commemorate the sort of anniversary of that. Not because that was a good thing, but because it was a bad thing, and we need to all stay awake and aware as to what that really means. And we're going to investigate the new developments in the investigation, which has been ongoing all these years, and there's still investigators writing books on the subject and also coming up with new details. So these are the kinds of things we're going to cover. We're also going to look into the impact to today, the fact that this was a coup in the American government and that it has implications going into the Trump administration and so on, to some very interesting developments having to do with what appears to be at least some kind of shutdown of the CIA. So we can also talk about that. And I've got some wonderful speakers here. We've got Paladin, a financial forensic investigator, and we've got Dammegard, who is also a very well-known investigator, as you know, into false flags and assassinations worldwide and over time. And he's written several books on the subject as well. And then we've got Dr. Jim Fetzer, and he is really an ex-Marine and a world-renowned professor who has been writing books and investigating various conspiracies of all kinds, it seems, and specializing in the Kennedy assassination, among other things. And we'll get each of them to give their own sort of bio when we go over to this other screen here. So if you'll just bear with me, Jim Fetzer, you're going to be first up to give your short bio. I want to give bios before you launch into your PowerPoint, if you don't mind. So just a few words about your background to the audience.
Oh, thanks, Carrie. I was commissioned in the Marine Corps upon graduation from Princeton, where I had majored in philosophy. My thesis advisor was actually the most influential philosopher in the world, and Princeton at the time was #1 in physics, math, and philosophy. I served 4 years in the Marine Corps, resigned my commission as a captain to enter graduate school, earned a PhD in the history and the philosophy of science, launched on a 35-year career as a professor of philosophy, principally offering courses in logic, critical thinking, and scientific reasoning. I published a couple of dozen books, mostly on scholarly subjects, such as the nature of scientific knowledge, the foundations of computer science, artificial intelligence, cognitive science, evolution, and mentality. After I retired in 2006, I began focusing more and more on the kinds of scams the government's been running against the public, and the belief that the American people are entitled to know the truth about their own history, where I have now become a founder and editor of moonrockbooks.com. And my latest is actually a book on JFK, one on Charlottesville, that has just been come off the press, hot off the press, as they say, literally true in this case.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you for that. So, Ole, why don't you give yourself an introduction there?
Well, I've spent some 30-odd years trying to find out what is going on in the world, and what I specialize is in top political assassinations and so-called false flag operations, or state-sponsored terrorism. And I'm also, if I can say it, I won the Prague Peace Prize last year. I'm also an international Raja Yoga teacher, and I try to focus on how to combine the two, the dark and the light, and try and get us out of this mess in the most efficient and beautiful way possible. So that's me. I've written multiple books as well. I've done several books together with Jim here. It's been a real pleasure. And the rest of my books can be found on Amazon and other platforms like that.
Wonderful. And your website is lightonconspiracies.com, correct?
Yep.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that. And Paladin, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I've been a licensed private investigator for over 30 years. I've got a BS in accounting. Spent 5 years in the private sector as an auditor and a financial manager and assistant treasurer. Also was a general contractor for single family homes, and I had a real estate sales license at one point. PI work includes testifying as a court recognized expert witness in forensic accounting. Had a contract to perform background investigations on police officers in Southern California for 8 years. Financial cases include embezzlement, stock manipulation, bank and investment fraud, trading program fraud, and then I've done other typical normal PI work, asset searches, skip tracing, surveillance, all those fun things, and sort of been the front man for the White Hats Report that we started 6 years ago at whitehatsreport.com.
Okay, and highly recommended everyone go over there. You were tracking the evidence behind the money into black projects, isn't that right?
Yes, yes.
And it's documents. You've got documents on your website, correct?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So at this point, we're going to turn the stage over to Jim Fetzer, who has a PowerPoint he wants to show us. As we go through the slides, if I get a signal from one of my other speakers that they want to say something, and that includes myself, we're going to stop Jim. So Jim, be patient with us while we ask you questions or make comments. And if you do have comments to add to the story, that's also valuable. So this is a roundtable discussion. It is not a lecture on the part of any one person. So, but go right ahead, Jim. Anxious to see what you have to share.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. Actually, it's ironic, but most of the key elements of the assassination were actually present already the day of the shooting. For example, Malcolm Kilduff, the acting press secretary, when he announced the death of JFK at 1 p.m. following the shooting at 12:30, he said it was a simple matter of a bullet right through the head, pointing to his right temple, a finding attributed to Admiral George Berkeley, who was the president's personal physician. On NBC that day, they had 5 hours of coverage nonstop. They began reporting 2 wounds, the shot to the head, which they reported that had led to a blowout at the back of the head, and a shot to the throat, where Malcolm Perry, MD, had reported during the Parkland press conference held at 1:30 to the assembled press. 3 times he described that the president had a small, clean puncture wound to the throat, through which he made a simple straight tracheostomy incision. 3 different times he explained the bullet was coming at him. Now, NBC was playing all this. Famous newsmen like Chet Huntley, you can see on the left, as the story started to come in that the shooter had been in the 6th floor of the book depository or above and behind. Frank McGee, who is nobody's fool, says, this is incongruous. How can the man have been shot from in front, from behind? Now, as the story started to come out, the Secret Service and the FBI agreed already the day of the assassination there had been 3 shots with 3 hits. That Jack had been hit in the back, about 5.5 inches below the collar, just to the right of the spinal column, that Conley had been hit in the back, and that Jack had been hit in the back, killing him. If you left aside the Conley issue, then you get 4 different shots to JFK that were already reported that day or by the following day. The shot to the throat and the shot to the right temple, both of which had been fired from in front, and the 2 shots to the back, the shot to the from behind, the shot to the back, and the shot to the back of the head. And believe it or not, that means we already knew the day of the shooting, if you were paying attention, that it had been a conspiracy with multiple shooters in multiple positions. Now, what would happen here was that they had to cope with this issue of the throat wound and so forth. Mark Lane, in his brilliant book, Rush to Judgment, explains how they did it. Here's a diagram of the throat wound by Charles Crenshaw, who is a physician present in trauma room number 1 when JFK's moribund body was brought in and would be responsible 2 days later for the treatment of his alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. You notice it was a simple, clean puncture wound and then with a straight line incision through it. There's no doubt this is what it looked like. Now, here's the shirt and jacket JFK was wearing. He had that hole in the jacket, as I described, about 5.5 inches below the collar, in a hole in the shirt. David W. Mantic, MD, PhD, who's the leading medical expert, actually had a member of the staff put on the shirt and the jacket and determined that the hole in the shirt was ever slightly below the hole in the jacket. But this defined the location where Jack was hit in the back, which even the Warren Commission staff agreed, as you can see here, during a reconstruction using the Secret Service Cadillac, the stand-in for JFK, has a big patch on the back of his jacket at the appropriate location corresponding to the holes in the shirt and the jacket, which, by the way, were left behind at Parkland and not taken to Bethesda in violation of autopsy protocol. And then a smaller patch right at the back of the head, you can see if you look carefully. How they coped with this was to have Gerald Ford, who was a junior member of the commission, re-describe the wound to the back from his uppermost back, which was already an exaggeration, to the base of the back of the neck. Ford insisted the change was intended to clarify meaning, not alter history. My changes had nothing to do with a conspiracy theory, he said in a telephone interview, but they were crucial to the cover-up. Because as you can see here, when you know where the bullet actually hit, as we can see from the shirt and the jacket, they made the move to the base of the back of the neck to claim the bullet had transited the neck and exited the throat, so that the throat wound now became an entry wound, went into the back of Connolly, so that no longer required a separate bullet. All of this being a violation of the laws of physics and physiology. Here you see the image of the bullet. Dr. Robert Shaw, who was treating Connolly, said he thought it was most unlikely that bullet could have done all this damage because he'd removed more lead fragments from Connolly's wrist than were missing from that bullet. The key role of Arlen Specter as a junior counsel in questioning the physicians who knew this wound up close and personal emerged when during their depositions, their testimony before the commission, he asked a hypothetical question. Not what they observed or what they had inferred of the bullet's entry and exit, but rather the following. If the bullet entered at the base of the back of the neck and transited the neck without hitting any bony structures and came out at the front of the neck, would that be consistent with describing the wound at the front of the neck as a wound of exit? Which, of course, is trivially true. Malcolm Perry, MD, for example, who knew this wound up close and personal, said yes, but that he was not in the position to vouch for or verify the assumptions he'd been asked to make, which in fact were counterfactual not only to the evidence of the case, but even in claiming the transition through without hitting any bony structures, because as David Mantic has determined, he took a patient with similar chest and neck dimensions and created a CAT scan, plotted the trajectory, and it's not even anatomically possible for the bullet to transit from the back of the neck to the exit the throat as described by the government without encountering cervical vertebrae, which means it's anatomically impossible, which is why when they do reconstructions of the shooting based upon the magic bullet theory, in the absence of which you have to have 6 or 7, wounds accounted for by multiple bullets, they use a stand-in or a model that's lacking a key anatomical feature, namely a backbone, which is ironic because JFK was taken out precisely because he had backbone. Even the New York Times, when it published a paperback edition of the Warren Report, had a faulty description here that doesn't correspond with the government's account, because that's actually approximately where the bullet entered, except it only went in as far as the second knuckle on your little finger, had no point of exit at a downward angle. It did not pass through JFK's body. So the New York Times, if it even studied its own images from the assassination, had to know things were completely wrong. So they were not getting something right. Now, if you proceed to the next book I would address, is Josiah Thompson, 1967, whereas Rush to Judgment was 1966. This was based on a micro study of the assassination using sketches from Zapruder film frames to which he had access from Time Life. He included a key diagram from one of the physicians at Parkland, Dr. Robert McClellan, of this massive wound at the back of the head. Many have described it. It's about the size of your fist when you double it up. If you took your right hand, double your fist and put it to the back of your head, that's the approximate location. Thompson also talked about the extant version of the Zapruder film and advanced what's known as the double hit theory, because whereas the explosion of his head occurs at frame 313, there's forward motion of the head from 312 to 313, and then violent motion back and to the left, which you see in the extant version of the Zapruder film, but which no one in Dealey Plaza actually witnessed because it was an artifact of the editing of the film. Harry had a graph. This was excellent work where David Lifton, doing independent research, would go to Caltech and consult with Richard Feynman, at the time the world's most famous physicist, with blow-up photographs of the relevant frames, and Feynman himself, using a ruler, confirmed the double hit theory, meaning that based upon the images in the Zapruder film, he'd been hit in the back of the head and then in the right temple and moved violently back into the left. What was peculiar about Thompson is that he ended his book saying, "What does this collection of new evidence prove? It does not prove that the assassination was a conspiracy and that two men were together on the 6th floor of the depository at the time the shots were fired." That's a peculiar sentence for several reasons. If you had a double hit from behind and from the front at nearly the same time, obviously it was a conspiracy. If there had been a shot from the front that caused that gaping wound described by Dr. McClellan, obviously there were shooters in front. So if there were shooters from behind, as the government claimed, obviously there was a conspiracy. To have a conspiracy, you don't have to have two men together on the 6th floor. Vincent Salandria, who was a brilliant first-generation student, was the first to call out Josiah Thompson as for his disinformation here, for concluding that even in the face of a lot of conspiracy evidence that there had been no conspiracy, or that the evidence didn't prove it. When I noticed he was disavowing his double hit theory as we were approaching the 50th observance in 2013, I called him out on the Education Forum, which was at the time the largest active discussion forum on the JFK assassination in the world. I had explained that he was setting himself up to deny the existence of conspiracy by the 50th, and I was proven right when the New York Times began to publish a series about the assassination, including short video interviews with Josiah Thompson made by the famous filmmaker Earl Morris, the first of which, of a series which I believe was intended to include 50 different elements at 6 minutes apiece, was debunking the idea that the umbrella man, who was standing on the sidewalk approximately the location where JFK would be hit with the fatal shot, where the driver, William Greer, would pull the limousine to the left and to a halt to make sure he would be killed, was pumping the umbrella. It was a location visible to all the shooting locations, where I've identified 6, and there may have been as many as 7 or even 8, that the pumping of the umbrella meant that the target is still alive, so you should keep shooting. And Josiah Thompson, during this interview, suggested that it was innocuous. The guy was there just with an umbrella to protest that Joe Kennedy had been accused of being an appeaser of Hitler in World War II. And he says, with a laughing, what it means is that if you have any fact which you think is really sinister, it's really obviously a fact which can only point to some sinister underpinning. Hey, forget it, man, because you can never on your own think up all the non-sinister, perfectly valid explanations for that fact. A cautionary tale. And one of the commentators would add, by the name of Mark M., "This was wonderful, the best and most convincing debunking of any and all conspiracy theories I've ever seen, and in just 6 minutes, too." But it was absurd. He wasn't debunking. He was offering an alternative explanation that did not make sense in the context of the assassination. It was the only umbrella in the entire motorcade. The weather was excellent. And the fact he was pumping indicated that it was fulfilling the role I have described. But Josiah Thompson was out to disavow conspiracy for the 50th. I published an article about it, JFK, the CIA, and the New York Times, and they discontinued the series. I think they felt it was just too risky to have him exposed as an op, and that they were damaging their cause.
Okay, just want to say here, thank you, Jim, for all of that. I just want to pause just for a moment. We do have a sort of a comment in the chat that it looks like some of the images are slightly blurry coming through on your PowerPoint. Just want to say that we're relying on the quality of the PowerPoint, and maybe the other images are going to be a little more clear. Not sure.
I'll just increase the size, Carrie. Maybe this will work better.
All right. Okay. And just want to give Ole and Paladin a chance to comment on anything they've heard so far, anything to add to anything you've heard so far.
No, I can just say, when it comes to, like an echo here, just like Jim say, I think I totally agree with the umbrella man. His job was there to show the cross point for the different shooters so that everybody would shoot at the exact same time, because you couldn't have like multiple shooters and then for them to shoot over a long distance of time, then blame it on one single shooter. So they needed to have everyone shooting more or less at the exact same moment. So that was the task of the umbrella man. No hidden weapon in the side, no poison arrows, no nothing like that, in my opinion.
Okay. Paladin, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that I think we have to consider that it wasn't the shooters. If they're looking through a high-powered rifle, a scope of a high-powered rifle, they're not going to see the umbrella man. But the umbrella man was, I think he was, as Jim and Ole said, signaling to the shooters through the shooter's spotters, because every sniper has a spotter. So I'm sure the spotter had his binoculars out and he's telling the shooter who is focused on the target whether to shoot or not. So yeah, I would agree. I just want to add that that was probably for the benefit of the spotters for each sniper.
Excellent point, Paladin. I agree completely. That's very, very good.
Okay.
Then we have a significant.
You're right, and I think there are pictures, are there not, of the umbrella man and a dark complected man who are sitting on the curb while everybody is running all over the place, and they're sitting there very calmly. And the dark complected man, if I'm not mistaken, is seen in a few pictures talking on his radio.
Well, not only that, but he steps out into the street and shakes a fist, which has been interpreted as a signal to the driver, William Greer, to pull the limousine to an abrupt halt, which is exactly what he does.
Very
and
good.
yes, they have been identified, and it's exactly as you say. They clearly knew what was going on. After the event, everyone else is running around like a chicken with their head cut off, but they're sitting there absolutely calmly as though nothing out of the ordinary had taken place.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yep.
I would like to say that if I'm correct, this man you're talking about, his name was Felipe Vidal Santiago, and he worked very closely to Operation 40. This ultra-secret hit team that was directly involved in this assassination. And after and during many years, he was working under the alias of Charles Morgan for AT&T and the CIA. And he was one of his major tasks was to, when there was a planned assassination in some country, his task was to go there and either recruit shooters or patsies for whatever operation there. And 23 years later, in the fall of 1985, he was actually in Stockholm as well, trying to recruit shooters there for the assassination of the Swedish Prime Minister, Olof Palme.
That's very good, Ole. Let me just tell the audience that Operation 40 was the code name for the CIA-sponsored counterintelligence group composed of Cuban exiles, and it was formed to, according to Wikipedia anyways, to seize control of Cuban government after the Bay of Pigs invasion, but it continued to operate and I think it became part of that European cabal, that other operation, forget the name of it. You know what I'm talking about, right?
You talk about Gladio?
Yeah, Gladio. So isn't Operation 40, isn't this group the same ultimately? You don't think these are the same players?
No. Operation 40 was created. It was the task was given to Richard Nixon when he was vice president to make an ultra-secret hit team that could be used anywhere in the world for any target, business or politicians or whatever. And through the help and assistance of people like David Atlee Phillips, the Blonde Ghost, whatever his name was. I'm sorry, it's in the middle of the night. I'm really tired. And also Ted Shackley and E. Howard Hunt. These three individuals recruited a lot of exiled Cubans into this group, and where the paymaster was actually George Bush Sr. For this hit team. And they were their first task was aimed towards Fidel Castro. Then after the Bay of Pigs disaster, when Kennedy became the main target of hatred, they aimed this sort of secret assassination cannon at Kennedy instead. And then after that, the people from the same organization, from this Operation 40, after the task was dealt with JFK, they were also involved in the assassinations of Robert Kennedy, John Lennon. There were key people in Operation Phoenix in Vietnam. They were also in Operation Condor in South America, where several people involved in this group also took part in different military coups in South America, the overtake in Chile, Salvador Allende, and the cleaning out of supporters of Allende and so on. So, but they've been active for many years. There's still some of them alive. They're very old now, but they've been very active.
Okay, was Chip Tatum part of that group?
No.
No? Okay, now what about Operation the Gladio? You're saying the Gladio is a separate group altogether?
Yeah, Gladio was an organization started by the CIA and NATO after the Second World War, I think around 1954. And what their task was to create like a ghost army so that all NATO countries would have their own ghost army in case of an invasion. The whole idea was that if any of the member countries would be invaded at that point from the east, then there would be hundreds of small cells in each and every country, consisting of like 8 to 10 people with hidden gun supplies, ammunition dug down, gasoline, food, radio equipment, all of these things, but in many cells that were only connected through radio. But the whole idea was that should an invasion happen, then the leaders of the country, the politicians, the crème de la crème, you name it, royalties and so on, would escape from the country, meet up in London, and from London they could then in one go, boom, activate a complete resistance movement in one go, just activate the whole thing.
Okay,
and that went under the name of Gladio. But where all different NATO countries gave these groups their own name. For instance, in Sweden, it was Stay Behind, and other countries as well, Stay Behind. But
okay, but I still am wondering if there's an overlap. They both were formed by the CIA, and it appears that Gladio, correct me if I'm wrong, is also responsible for some of the false flags that we've been seeing. And so I'm really wondering whether or not there was an overlap with this other group. You know what I'm saying?
For sure, but Operation 40 was just the name, or Group 40 was just the name of this group of assassins at that point. Then they regrouped, they changed the names over the years, you know, new targets, new operations, they changed the name, they changed the setup, and so on. Some members of this group were also part of blowing up Orlando Lettier in Washington, D.C., at the Embassy Row and so on. So, but it was a very small group, but these people became sort of like teachers, like terror teachers for younger people and so on. And so when Chip Tatum, for instance, when he was recruited as a 19-year-old, by by William Colby and Ted Shackley as well. He was sort of in the outskirts, moving around where these old guys were, but they never. He was never part of Operation 40 as such.
Okay, very interesting. Any comments, either one of you, or we'll let Fetzer continue at this point?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, please, Jim, continue.
Okay, go right ahead, Jim. Then we'll give the floor back to you.
Well, in 1980, we had an unbelievably searching investigation by David Lifton, who'd been a student of physics who became diverted by the Kennedy assassination and applied his formidable intellect to the case. He was the first to ferret out that they might have actually altered the body, which is normally in a murder case the best evidence. What he noticed, for example, was that the autopsy photographs showed a tracheostomy that was greatly enlarged from what had been previously described. You can see above the Crenshaw drawings of the small, clean entry wound, straight incision, very consistent with Malcolm Perry's description. But at the lower left, you can see this is a very large, expanded wound, very different than we had from the physicians who were there. The eyes are open, which is odd because Charles Crenshaw was the last physician to see the body as it was folded in sheets and put in the bronze ceremonial casket at Parkland, and he closed the eyes of JFK. What you see at the right is from the House Select Committee on Assassinations Reconstruction, which I'll address subsequently, but where I point out the skull flap. When Jack was hit in the right temple, it was a frangible exploding bullet that blew a part of the skull open. It's about a 3-inch curved segment of skull that becomes significant when we later look at photographs and drawings and diagrams just for orientation. Now, Lifton had encounters with the various physicians, but he didn't see Dr. Malcolm Perry in 1963, who'd performed the tracheostomy. Perry had held a news conference in which he stated 3 times that he was shot in the throat from the front. The wound was 3 to 5 millimeters. He told Humes the morning after the shooting. In 66, Perry told me his incision through the wound was 2 to 3 centimeters. In 79, researcher Robert Groden, a consultant to the House Committee, was present at an unofficial, privately arranged meeting where Dr. Perry was shown an autopsy photograph clearly showing the throat wound, to wit, the one I've just shown. Perry looked at the picture, shook his head from side to side, and then, on the condition he not be quoted, gave his reaction. The tracheotomy was too large. It wasn't trach he'd made. He said the throat wound in the picture was larger, expanded. His was neater. Perry also said the head wound was not the way he remembered it either, that the picture published in 6 Seconds at Dallas by Dr. McClellan, which I've shown, was much closer. Perry's reaction, Groden said, it was one of the most vivid memories I have of this case. I knew it was important. I knew it was historic. Groden first told Lifton of the meeting with Perry shortly after it occurred. He's honored Perry's confidence these many years, but is now given permission to quote what Perry said in 79, because Dr. Perry has recently told the television program Nova that he sees no discrepancy between the trach incision he made and the trach wound depicted in the diagrams and the photograph there. Lifton was very astute in noticing that in the Bethesda autopsy report, there's a mathematical description of the wound at the back of the head, and it is enormous, roughly 5 times the size of what we had coming out of Parkland. He was studying differences too between the Zapruder film and the medical evidence, the autopsy and so forth. On the 22nd, the film, in the opinion of most doctors, showed the headshot from in front. I mean, that's of course when he was still assuming the film was authentic. But on November 22nd, the FBI said it was a shot from the rear. On the 24th, the Bethesda autopsy report said it was a shot from the rear. Similarly, in the case of the neck, on November 22nd, the FBI reported it was non-transiting, meaning it entered, but it didn't go anywhere. In fact, Bob Livingston, world authority on the human brain, explained to me he believed it hit bone and fragmented apart going upward to rupture this very tough membrane that covers the cerebellum, known as a tentorum, where even the near simultaneous impact of 2 shots would not have allowed cerebellar tissue to extrude from the wound unless the tentorum had been ruptured and the other part going downward into the lung. According to the Navy autopsy, the Bethesda autopsy report, of course, there was a transit meaning now the bullet, of course, was going from the back to the front. Here's a description, the diagram that Lifton actually called a physician without identifying the patient and read him the description from the Bethesda autopsy report and said, what did that sound like to him? And he said it sounded like he'd been hit in the head with an axe. And you can see how much more enormous is the wound as described in the autopsy report than from Parkland. And where Lifton also was the first to put his finger on funny business with the ambulances. It turns out that when the plane, Air Force One, landed at Andrews Air Force Base and the world's attention was focused on Jackie and Bobby and the bronze ceremonial casket being offloaded in the front and put into the gray Navy ambulance, which Jackie would enter, and with a very large entourage head off for Bethesda Naval Hospital. The body had actually already been removed from the casket and put in a body bag. It was offloaded the opposite side into a helicopter, which flew the body to Walter Reed, where the best forensic pathologists in the military removed bullet fragments. It was then wrapped back up, put in a body bag, and in a pinkish gray shipping casket, the kind that was being used to bring bodies back from Vietnam, transported in a black hearse to the back of the Bethesda Hospital, where it was then brought in and the body put onto the table for the autopsy. Gerald Custer, who was a radiation technician who was taking the autopsy x-rays, was headed upstairs in the company of two Secret Service agents to develop an x-ray he'd just taken. When he looked out in the front and saw this huge entourage with a gray Navy ambulance and Jackie Kennedy entering the building, he thought this was very strange because the body was already undergoing autopsy in the morgue. Lifton was completely brilliant to put these pieces of a very complex puzzle together. Now, the next book of great significance is Robert Grote's The Killing of a President, which purports to be a complete photographic record of the assassination. Many regard this as a virtual Bible of the assassination. It includes discussion of this very famous photograph taken by AP photographer James Ike Alchett. If you look carefully, you can see there's a small white spiral nebula right here where JFK's left ear would be if his left ear were visible, of that shot to the throat which passed through the windshield. In the background, you can see this area in the doorway where this figure has been supposed to look a great deal like Lee Oswald. In fact, Harold Weisberg, who published a series of books called Whitewash, in his second photographic whitewash, 1966, said the Warren Commission was having trouble trying to provide an explanation away that was not Oswald in the doorway. Here we also find a very important window of a broom closet for a uranium mining company that turns out to be a CIA or Mossad asset from which 3 shots were fired, the only unsilenced shots that were fired during the assassination, to set up the acoustical impression of only 3 shots having been fired, because all the others were with weapons that had silencers. Now, Groden, oddly enough, denies there's a bullet hole in the windshield, which is very, very strange in and of itself. He actually says, taken by Ike Alchett just after the first 4 shots, remember, not all the shots hit, shows the windshield of the president's car with no sign of damage from gunfire. But that's simply false. You can see it right here. This is from the page in his book, The Killing of a President. Here you can see that what he highlights as being the windshield the Secret Service claimed was on the limousine at the time. But in fact, that's a substitute windshield. Douglas Weldon, JD, an attorney from Kalamazoo, Michigan, did a brilliant study of the limousine and tracked down the official at Ford Motor Company who'd replaced the windshield when the vehicle was completely stripped down to bare metal and rebuilt on the 25th, the day of the formal state funeral, who confirmed the through and through bullet hole, and they replaced it with a clean windshield. So this is yet a third that the Secret Service produced, which Groden is endorsing as though it were the actual. But the fact is the bullet hole is visible in the windshield. The spider crack is not what was on the limousine at the time. There were multiple witnesses at Parkland, including a police officer who actually stuck a pencil through the hole. Not only that, but we have further research by Douglas Horn, who is a senior analyst for military records for the Assassination Records Review Board, photographic evidence of bullet hole in JFK windshield, 4 June 2012. JFK conspiracy, the bullet hole in the windshield, 28 June 2012. And from Dennis Camino, tampering with a limo in the Alton 6, 20 March 2013. Indeed, as other students have observed, it can also be seen in Zapruder frame 225, where I put an orange circle around it. This is now very important because Thomas Evan Robinson was a mortician who prepared the body for the funeral. He did a phone interview with a private investigator on May 26, 1992, and described the wounds as follows. Large gaping hole in back of head, patched by stretching piece of rubber over it, thinks the skull was full of plaster of Paris. Smaller wound in the right temple. Crescent-shaped flap down 3 inches. That's a skull flap he's talking about. The smaller wound is the entrance wound in the right temple. Approximately 2 small shrapnel wounds in face packed with wax. This is very interesting because when he tried to infuse the body with embalming fluid, it leaked out of the face, and therefore he had to pack it with wax. David Mantic, the leading expert on the medical evidence, brilliantly inferred this was from tiny shards of glass that had been released when the bullet passed through the windshield and hit Jack in the face. Wound in the back 5 to 6 inches below the shoulder to the right of the backbone. Adrenaline gland and brain removed, other organs removed and then put back. No smelling or discoloration of face, which means he died instantly. Now, Groden includes many diagrams of witnesses who reported the location of that fist-sized blowout at the back of the head. Beverly Oliver, who was actually there filming the assassination, Phil Willis, Marilyn Willis, witnesses, Ed Hoffman, who was on the triple underpass, many physicians from Parkland, Robert McClellan, Paul Peters, Kenneth Sellier, Charles Carrico, Richard Delaney, Charles Crenshaw, Ronald Jones, Nurse Audrey Bell, the Dallas, the justice of the peace Theron Ward, who tried to stop the Secret Service from forcibly removing the body, Aubrey Wright, the ambulance driver who felt the defect when he helped to lift the body into the ceremonial bronze casket when it was wrapped in sheets. At Bethesda, Frank O'Neill was an FBI agent who was present. Gerald Custer, Paul O'Connor, Floyd Ruby, all medical techs who witnessed that wound. But what we have from Groden at the top, or what he claims to be crucial autopsy photographs, look at all the mass and gunk and hair, in contrast, for example, with the House Select Committee's photographs where the hair is clean and neat, leading a question to be asked of Humes when he was deposed by the Assassination Record Review Board. Did he give the patient a shampoo and a haircut, which of course he denied? It's simply absurd. All 4 of these photographs turn out to be fake. You can see the skull flap very carefully here, however. In fact, you see the House Select Committee reconstruction at the bottom isn't even consistent with the Harper fragment, this very large triangular chunk of skull that was found the following day on the grass by a medical student named Billy Harper, who had a relative on the medical school at Methodist Hospital who photographed it and determined it was from the back of the head. Here we have a comparison of JFK profile with the figure that Groden has advanced. Here's another, and although you can't see it here now, we have done a GIF, and it's very obvious that the man in the photographs Groden advances is not even JFK. In other words, he has advanced the hypothesis. He's promoted 2 photographs as the key to the assassination that aren't even of JFK. In fact, Groden and I were both invited to speak before an advanced history class at a high school in Des Moines, Iowa. While we were sitting together, just the 2 of us, he offered to let me use his color photograph. And I told him, well, you know, they're fake, to which he had no response. That we have discovered this lends now further credence to the hypothesis of Robert Morningstar that Officer J.D. Tippett, who was shot and blamed on Oswald, even though he clearly did not shoot them. It took place about 1:10. Oswald was already in the Texas theater ordering popcorn for Butch Barrows, as he has attested. You can find his affidavit online. Tippett was shot 3 times in the torso and once in the right temple. The first officer on the scene found 4 shell casings that had been ejected from automatics. He initialed the 4 shell casings of 2 different makes, 2 Western and 2 Remington and 2 Western cartridge casings. When they discovered the glitch, they were replaced by 4 revolver shell casings. Since Oswald only had a revolver, it would have been absurd for him to shoot a police officer, open the chamber, and remove the incriminating shell casings. But now there were 3 of one make one of the other. They no longer had the officer's initials. Aquila Clemens, watching from across the street, testified 2 men shot Tippett, and neither of them looked like Oswald. But now Robert Morningstar's proposal that Tippett, who was kidded by his fellow Dallas officers for looking so much like JFK, may have been killed to be used as a body double in Dallas, at Bethesda. We now have to take that hypothesis very seriously. So while we've shown that the body shown in the autopsy photographs is not JFK, we are in the process of confirming whether it was or was not J.D. Tippett.
Okay, I just want to pause you there. We've got a comment from Paladin, so if you just bear with me. Paladin, go ahead. Okay,
Jim, I've been looking into the Tippett situation here the last few weeks, and I know of Morningstar's hypothesis that they switched bodies and they used Tippett's body, but I did check the records, and the Justice of the Peace signed over authorization to do an autopsy at 3 o'clock. Dr. Rose started the autopsy at 3:15 and didn't finish it till 7 o'clock, at which time, you know, JFK's body was already back in Washington. And I think I don't know what time they started the autopsy, but if, you know, Dr. Rose is correct and he was actually doing an autopsy on Tippett, I don't see how Tippett's body could have gotten up there in time to, you know,
Paladin, frankly, I agree with you. I obtained Tippett's autopsy report, including the photographs. It was a very meticulous, very thorough medical examination. Your timeline argument is perfect, spot on. It's simply obvious now that the body that Groden has promoted in the autopsy photographs was not JFK. And I frankly believe that when we do an attempt to verify that will turn out it was not Tippett, I think your argument is impeccable, and I happen to agree with it. But it's fascinating. When I published about this and showing that the autopsy body was wrong, and also other gifts, which you can find in my blog article entitled Bethesda Autopsy Photos Not JFK, Oswald framed Warren report a sham with these gifts. For some reason, although I was showing a police officer who'd stood in for Lee Oswald in the backyard photographs, they thought I was also suggesting the same police officer had served as the replacement, the body double for JFK at Bethesda, which of course is ridiculous. So I introduced this, I've just introduced this image here to show that, you know, we're not certain who it was that replaced. Actually, Dennis David, who was the non-commissioned officer who was keeping track of who was going into and out of the morgue, was told not to record another body that was there in a casket. He was told it was the body of a major. And I suspect now that it will turn out that the body that was used for JFK was the body in the casket he was told not to record of the major, and not J.D. Tippett. So I think your point here is exceptional.
Okay.
And
thank you.
I wanted to add too that I think it's been reported that when Jackie and Bobby went in to see the body after the autopsy, they both commented that it didn't look like Jack.
Yes, and the reason it didn't look like Jack was it was not Jack. You're absolutely right, 100%. That's correct. I would have added that too.
All right, now Ole wanted to say a couple words. Go ahead, Ole.
No, I just want to say I think this is really, really an interesting area with these body switches and what happened there. This is something we really need to continue looking into until we really found what was the real truth behind it. I just want to, I forgot when I was talking about Gladio before, I just want to expand a little there. The idea with Gladio was in the case of an invasion, but what then happened when the threat from the east, when the Russian power just declined or wasn't that strong anymore, what happened was that the powers in the CIA, and so they came up with this called a strategy called the strategy of tension, and because they found that they had this massive big ghost army that nobody knew about, so they were like, why don't we use it for something? And that is when they started using it to inflict terror, inflict fear in modern society. And this is where we have seen from at least the 50s, but in the 60s for sure, when parts of Gladio has been used as a terror tool in Western Europe and in other parts of the countries as well. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, I thought perhaps you had something, did you say about the bullet, or was that, did I misunderstand that?
No, I think what both Paladin and Jim has been saying is absolutely excellent.
Okay, very good. So Jim, you have the floor again.
Thank you, Carrie. Well, the next book I cite is Assassination Science, where I brought together the best experts to study the case, the world authority on the human brain, also expert on wound ballistics, Bob Livingston, David Manick, PhD, MD, PhD physics, MD from Wisconsin, MD from Michigan, board certified in radiation oncology, which is a treatment of cancer using X-ray therapy. So he's an expert on the interpretation of X-rays. Charles Crenshaw, who was president of trauma room #1 when JFK's moribund body was brought in. 2 days later, responsible for the care and treatment of his alleged assassin, Lee Oswald. Jack White, a legendary photo and film analyst. Subsequently, another PhD, John P. Costello from Australia, whose area of specialization is electromagnetism, the properties of light and the images of moving objects, who did brilliant work demonstrating it based upon its internal features, that the extant version of the Zapruder film is a fabrication made out of real film, original footage, but then massively edited and revised. David discovered when he entered the archives the very first time what he suspected before going in, namely that the autopsy x-rays had been altered. Here you see this is the lateral cranial, or the x-ray of the skull taken from the right side. He applied a technique from physics known as optical densitometry that measures the amount of light that passes through an x-ray to determine the relative density of the objects whose exposure to x-rays created the image, and defined an area P, you can see here, where there was much too dense material to be human bone. Actually, it was as dense as the petrous bone, which is in the ear canal, which is here it is here, which is the densest bone in the human body. So they had patched that fist-sized blowout to the back of the head. Here is Crenshaw's drawing of that, just to add to the discussion, where he drew this. And for me, I published it in Assassination Science, but it fits right here. You can see the blowout both from the side, that there was a big gap, at the side of the head. David also discovered there was evidence internal to the x-rays of the second shot to the head. This is from that frangible or exploding bullet that entered the right temple, where you see metallic particles distributed in accordance with the laws of physics. We had two, and Bob Livingston was particularly affected by this, physician after physician at Parkland describing extruding cerebellar as well as cerebral tissue, where the cerebellum is a compact part of the brain just above the brainstem. You had Crenshaw talking about cerebellum hanging out, Jenkins, cerebellum protruding from the wound, Carrico, cerebellum and cerebral tissue, Perry, cerebral and visible brain tissue and some cerebellum, McClellan, cerebral and cerebellar tissue, Baxter, cerebellum was present, Kemp Clark, the director of neurosurgery, cerebral and cerebellar tissue, which led Bob Livingston to conclude that the brain shown in diagrams and photographs here at the top in the National Archives could not be the brain of JFK, who after all had half his brains blown out at Dealey Plaza, but particularly because it shows a completely intact cerebellum. All
right. I'm sorry. Paladin has some comments, so if you want to finish this little section, and then
just one more sentence, and then Paladin can comment.
Go right ahead.
So Bob Livingston reported, it simply cannot be true that the cerebellum could have been seen extruding from the occipital parietal wound by several experienced and thoroughly competent physicians, and for the same brain to be seen in superior and lateral photographs and depicted in a drawing superior view showing the cerebellum as being apparently intact. The conclusion is obligatorily forced that the photographs and drawings of the brain in the National Archives are those some brain other than that of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Once they patched the hole in the back of the head, there was nowhere for the brains to go. They had to reconstitute the brain. As we will learn, there were two different brain examinations, and they used a substitute brain that was abnormally large. It weighed in at 1,500 grams. Bob explained to me the average adult male brain weighs in at 1,350, but it was also completely intact, which is, of course, absurd given what we know about the case. Paladin.
Yeah, I want to back up just a minute to go to best evidence. I got a story about Dr. Perry. I met a colleague of his who was a doctor, and we were talking about the Kennedy assassination, and this guy said, hey, I know a doctor who was in the ER when they brought him in, Dr. Perry. I go, really? He said, yeah. He said he's the one that did the tracheotomy on the bullet wound because there was already a hole there, so he decided that was the quickest and easiest way to go in. And after he saw the autopsy photo of the butchered hole in Kennedy's neck, he was livid because he took it as a personal affront that, you know, he would never do a tracheotomy that bad. And obviously somebody got into the throat wound and took out all the bullet fragments. So,
well, here's what happened. Bob Livingston, hearing the description of the wound to the throat, and based upon his experience supervising an emergency medical hospital for injured Okinawans and Japanese prisoners of war during the Battle of Okinawa, called over to Humes. The officer of the deck put him through. He was the scientific director of two of the National Institutes for Health, which are located across the street from Bethesda Naval Hospital. They had a conversation during which Bob explained he'd heard the report over the radio of the small, clean puncture wound to the throat, that it was obviously a wound of entry, and therefore, and this is so ironic in retrospect, if in fact there were evidence of shots from behind, then they would know there had been at least two shooters and therefore a conspiracy. He was astounded when the FBI interrupted and wouldn't allow them to complete their call. Later that evening, Humes called Livingston and asked him to describe what the wound would have looked like had it been a wound of exit. Bob described it to him, and it appears that Humes used Livingston's description to alter the wound to look as we see here in the left bottom, and of course it would outrage him. I mean, look at the clean puncture wound with a straight line incision that Perry had actually done. As I explained, Perry seems to have been, convinced, and I think he was browbeaten. They had a guy who was assigned to Perry to beat him up psychologically and emotionally to change his mind, such that he would subsequently agree that his incision had been the same as that was shown in the photographs, which is, of course, completely absurd. I wrote to Perry about this, by the way, because I thought, he would be such a valuable witness, and I got a lengthy, it was about a 4-page handwritten a note in pencil. And he was saying when the Parkland press conference transcripts were eventually released, it would be obvious that he was right about this having been an exit wound rather than an entry, when in fact the transcripts, which I published in Assassination Science, show exactly the opposite. He 3 times described it as a wound of entry. So I think something has happened to Dr. Perry in the meanwhile. He began a simply excellent, dedicated American and physician, but he was induced, he was browbeaten into actually believing what is false about what he did with JFK's throat. It's an astonishing story.
Okay, just want to allow Paladin, do you have more? Sorry.
Yeah. And just to follow up on what Jim was saying, this other doctor, a colleague of Dr. Perry's who I was talking to, told me that they threatened him. He didn't identify who they was, but he said he was threatened. So, and if I'm not mistaken, didn't Humes destroy his autopsy notes and that night after he found out about the throat wound and rewrite them? Jim didn't.
No, it was a different sequence. Humes took the first version to Captain Stover, who was the head of the Bethesda Naval Hospital, and Stover forced him to rewrite it and instructed him to burn the notes.
Yeah,
Humes would later make up the fanciful story that they had blood on him and he didn't want them to become a ghoulish object of speculation, but that's just nonsense. He actually did a second version that was also rejected So it was only the third version that actually survived and was published, which has that massive 5 times the size of the fist-sized wound description, which David Lifton so brilliantly discerned. I mean, I'm telling you, when all is said and done, I think the book that represents a turning point in the history of research on the assassination is David Lifton's best evidence. In fact, I regard my own books as sequels.
Well,
now, go ahead.
I have to admit, Jim, the light went on completely when I saw when I read Best Evidence. I'll never forget reading that book. I mean, that gave you pause. Okay, I want to move on here.
Well, I want to agree with you. I was about to say, when I got serious, when I returned from 13 months in the Far East, I'd been anchored out in Kaohsiung Harbor aboard the LPH Iwo Jima. That's a helicopter carrier. That doesn't have to have a deep keel like a normal carrier, because fixed-wing aircraft require that stable platform, but helicopters just go up and down. I was awakened at 3:30 in the morning by the officer of the deck of the mortar battery, of which I was the fire direction officer, to tell me the president had been shot. He awakened me an hour later to tell me they caught the guy who'd done it. He was a communist. I thought then it was pretty fast work. I know now, of course, why. When I returned to the United States, I became interested in the assassination. I read, for example, Josiah Thompson's 6 Seconds in Dallas. That absorbed my attention. When I got serious about it in 1992, I learned more from David Lifton's book, Best Evidence, than any other source I ever consulted. It's a completely brilliant piece of work. Now here we have murder and
I just have to stop you there, Jim, just for a moment. Paladin, did you have something else you seemed to say you wanted to go somewhere else?
Yeah, I wanted to just say I watched some video of the landing at the airport, and as I recall this that night, as a second grader, there was a helicopter in the background the whole time, and you could hear it in the 9-minute video that I watched. And I don't know which of the 3 networks, because we only had 3 networks at that point. And the commentators said 3 times that the helicopters, because you could hear them and they were having to talk over them, they said the helicopters were going to take the body to the autopsy. And then the gray ambulance shows up, and then they say, well, now that it's going to take, they're going to take the coffin they're going to put it in the ambulance, and the ambulance is then going to take it to the helicopters. So I thought that was funny. They said 3 times on that 9-minute newscast that they were going to take the body away in a helicopter. And of course, as we all know, they took it away in the hearse. Okay. Another thing about
that's a brilliant recollection, because, this was a real subtle move, distracting the public with the unloading of the bronze ceremonial casket while they're actually unloading the body on the opposite side.
Right.
And in fact, Lifton pointed out that they played a game with the ambulances, try to confuse the public. But, when Gerald Custer is headed upstairs with x-rays from his body's already undergoing autopsy, and the gray ambulance shows up, it was a feint, it was a deception. They had to get the body to Walter Reed to remove bullet fragments. Fragments of 2 different calibers should show up during the autopsy. They had to avoid that. The shooters were using their preferred weapons. Yeah.
Yeah, Dennis David also witnessed the gray ambulance pull up with Jackie and Bobby in the empty coffin. He also observed that too.
Guy. I've spent time with Dennis. We've had dinner together. He's a super guy. I actually was responsible for, with David Mandick and Gary Aguilar, for hiring a New York City psychiatrist who'd done work with the Secret Service and the FBI to hypnotize Dennis David to see if he could recollect doing a memorandum for the FBI on the receipt of bullet fragments that were more than 1 bullet but less than 2, and he remembered every single keystroke. Wow. The guy was a perfect subject for hypnosis. Really fascinating stuff. So
so let's Paladin, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to go to the Grodin book that you mentioned. Now, I don't know if you've got it handy, or I don't know if you've seen this. I don't know if you've seen this photograph. I'm sure you have, but you may not have noticed. On page 42 of Grodin's book, Jim.
Got it in my hands.
Okay, go to 42. It looks like it's an Altgen's photo.
Yeah.
And Clint Hill is climbing up on the trunk. Jackie is coming back towards Clint Hill.
That's a fake photograph. Alchins himself didn't even remember taking it. It's a fabrication. We've been able to prove it.
Okay, what drew my attention is, do you see the car in front of the limousine?
Well, that's a pilot car. Yeah, they slowed down. That was driven by, I think, Jesse Curry, and they had a couple Secret Service guys who've been involved in setting it up.
But tell me what the license plate number is.
No, that's the flag from the presidential limousine. I know. People say it's obscuring the license plate, but that's actually the flag from the presidential limousine.
Okay, so that's not, so they haven't doctored that photo.
No, that's just a flag. Well, the whole photo is a fake, but that particular feature, that was the flag of the limo.
Okay.
It's very interesting. I mean, you know.
Okay, let's let Paladin finish. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, one more thing on the bodies, switching of the bodies. The interesting story that not too many people know about, I'm sure you do, Jim, is the Liggett story, where Liggett was supposedly...
Yes.
Okay.
Liggett was a wizard with a scalpel. He could reconstruct body parts and so forth. I believe he was brought in actually to reconstruct the right ear, because the frangible exploding bullet not only blew out that skull flap, but I think it probably destroyed the right ear. He was a wizard. It was very strange what you know, his journey of involvement here, where he actually took his whole family out of town until Lee Oswald had been shot by Jack Ruby. And then he relaxed and said, we can go home now. But he played a very mysterious role in the background. You're spot on, Paladin. You know your stuff.
Well, and the thing of it is with Liggett, I can't understand why, because Oswald got killed, did he relax? It makes no sense if he was in there to mess with the body.
I
did
think
Oswald know about him that made him relax once Oswald was out of the picture? That's my only question.
Well, I think that was just sealing the deal, that Oswald knew too much, because he'd been a government agent. He'd been recruited from the recruit depot in San Diego, where I'd subsequently serve as a series commander with 15 DIs and 300 recruits. By the Office of Naval Intelligence, he would be stationed at Atsugi, our most secure base in Japan, from which the U-2 overflights took place.
Right.
He would do a pseudo defection at the behest of the CIA to bring information about the altitude to the Soviets. When Khrushchev and Eisenhower were about to have a summit that was intended to reduce Cold War tensions, Khrushchev accused the United States of spying on the Soviet Union, which Eisenhower predictably denied. Then they produced Francis Gary Powers, the pilot, and parts of the U-2, which they'd been able to shoot down. It was very embarrassing. It led to abandoning the summit and an increase in Cold War tensions. When Lee returned to the United States after marrying the niece of a KGB colonel, he was received not as a traitor, but actually given money by a CIA front organization. He wound up in Dallas, where he was being sheep-dipped, given a false identity as a pro-Castro communist sympathizer, while Marina went to Dallas with the Paynes, who would subsequently be involved in getting Lee a job at the book depository just 2 weeks before the assassination. It was all very cleverly contrived. I mean, the Paynes also had ties to the CIA. De Morin's child, who was many regard as Lee's handler, was tied to the CIA. The whole op appears to have been a CIA op. Even the book depository looks like it was involved and under the control of the agency. I mean, people have no idea of the enormity of the scope and reach of the CIA, which is why, if things are going on today that may involve its dismantlement, as Kerry was mentioning at the very beginning, this could only be a good thing for the United States and devoutly to be wished.
Okay, Paladin, did you have anything more? Should we continue?
That'll do it. We can go on now.
Okay, now just a cautionary note here. We are almost, well, we got about 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes for this to be a 2-hour thing. And I just want to say that there are I want to bring some points up to the, present of things that are happening and get your feedback, all of these guys. So I want to leave time for that. So Jim, I'm not sure, I know you're going really fast and you're really good at this kind of thing. Just want to make sure that we allow time for everything. So
do you want to expand it to 3 hours, Kerry? Is that possible? I think that would work.
No, I think that's a bit much, for the audience sake. So I don't know how much more you've got going on here with the slides.
Well, we're solving the world's greatest murder mystery. I can give an abbreviated version. I'll do my best.
All right, no problem. I don't want to cramp your style at all. So we do want to continue, but just wanted to put that footnote in there.
Well, when you have persons of the caliber of Paladin and Ole, you want to take full advantage, Carrie. I mean, this is an extraordinary occasion to have the three of us together. I mean, this is really good.
Yes, I'm very happy.
Personally,
all right.
I think your audience would have the patience for more, because they're not going to get this kind of thorough discussion and detail from three experts of this quality ever again. I mean, this is like a unique occasion. Okay.
It is. Okay, let me check with Ole as well. He's in Europe. It's probably running on at least 2 or 3 in the morning over there.
Oh yeah, I know.
So Ole, if you have things to contribute, like if you prepared anything, just tell us the point at which you need to share what you've got, and if in case you just can't stay awake any longer, it's understandable. So I just want to give you a chance on that. What's your status, Ole?
The status is almost 3 o'clock in the morning, so these eyes are a bit tired. But I think what is very important to understand is that the JFK assassination is one of the major turning points in the modern world history. And the most important with that is not so much the details, what happened and so on, but who committed it and what happened to them afterwards. Are they still active? And I would very much suggest that the forces that took out this brave man in 1963, that they actually committed a coup d'etat, and that this very brutal death machine that slaughtered this man is still active. This is what we're still facing. It's just been concentrated the power to fewer and fewer and fewer. So it's very important to identify the players behind this murder, and where I believe that George Bush Sr. is one of the few people still alive, but where he was key there and has been key in so many things since then. So especially the Bush connections are very, very important. But also the whole New World Order agenda that is behind this assassination. So I think when you see from 1963, then 9/11 was the second major turning point, where indirectly the same forces just pushed their way forward. So I just think it's very important.
In accordance with that, let me make a great leap forward, which Ole will appreciate, to Noel Twyman's Bloody Treason, published in 1997, because he gives an overview about the assassination that I think Ole would find useful as a point of response. I think what Ole's saying is extremely important. What Noel put his finger on was that the arrangement with the greatest probability of success, the most perfect combination, was to combine the CIA military with the Secret Service, with the Mafia, with LBJ and Hoover. Lyndon actually forced himself on the ticket in Los Angeles in 1960. Jack had extended the invitation to be his running mate to Stuart Symington of Missouri, but gave him overnight to think about it. Bobby went by the Johnson suite with a pro forma offer, never imagining he'd show the least interest. Instead, Lyndon leaped on it, using information from J. Edgar. He threatened to expose that Jack had Addison's disease and wasn't expected to live a long, healthy life, that he'd had dalliances with beautiful women, some of whom were spies from East Germany, both of which were true, and that if he were not on the ticket, then in his position as a powerful majority leader, he'd bottle up any legislative proposal sent down by the White House, which would be dead on arrival. Bobby and Jack couldn't figure a way out of it. Lyndon had them boxed in. They had to accede to Lyndon's demand. When one of his wealthy backers learned of this, he burst into the Johnson suite cursing and swearing that now Lyndon was going to help JFK become president. Bobby Baker took him into a bedroom and explained what they had in mind. He came out all smiles and said that was an excellent plan. Bobby Baker came out, would state publicly that JFK would not live out his first term and that he would die a violent death. Lyndon Johnson would send his chief administrative aide, Cliff Carter, down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination. Also, Noel exposed that the people who claim, no one ever talked about it and therefore it can't have been a conspiracy were ignoring many key players who talked, including Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, Joseph Miltier, Johnny Rosselli, David Atlee Phillips, Lyndon Johnson, Madeline Brown, Marita Lawrence, Frank Sturgis, Sam Giancana, Chauncey Holt, Charles Harrelson, Jim Hicks, Jack Ruby, Billy Solestis. Let me just mention about Jack Ruby. When he was being questioned by reporters, when he was seeking to testify and asked Earl Warren to bring him back to Washington where he felt safe, he was saying this would never have happened if someone else had been vice president. He offered Adlai Stevenson as an example. They asked, are you saying the man responsible is the man at the top now? And Ruby said yes. He was very explicit about it. When E. Howard Hunt was on the verge of death, he actually survived, but at the time he thought he was on his last legs. He gave a confession to his son, St. John, whom I have spoken with and saw this past weekend in Dallas, that the chain of command had been from Lyndon Johnson to Cord Meyer to David Atlee Phillips to William Harvey to David Sanchez Morales. And below them were the various shooters, their coordinators, the mechanics and their supervisors and coordinators, who included George Herbert Walker Bush and Edward Lansdale, who many of us have concluded actually positioned the shooters and determined the sequence of shots. The actual assassination looked like this, where we had the first shot fired from the top of the county records building, the first shot that hit, at least, it hit Jack in the back by a Dallas deputy sheriff, on my account, Harry Weatherford, who'd obtained a silencer, a high-quality silencer just before the assassination, using a 30-06 to fire a Mannlicher Garcano with a plastic collar known as a sabot. The shot to the throat was fired from actually inside the triple underpass, in other words, further over. That's this orange shot here. That passed through the windshield by Jack Lawrence, who was an Air Force expert who went to work for the automobile dealership that provided the vehicles for the motorcade, which were many different makes, models, and colors, so that the conspirators could easily determine where everyone was in the motorcade. In fact, Jack's military aide was moved to the furthest back vehicle with his personal physician, because had he been in the front seat, the shot that passed through the windshield that hit Jack in the throat would have hit his military aide. In addition, we had those 3 shots fired from the Dow Tex by an anti-Castro Cuban, using a Mannlicher Garcano, which is such an unreliable weapon that even though these were virtually on the horizontal, because Elm Street has an 11-degree incline, he had 2 misses, one of which hit a distant curbing and injured a bystander by the name of James Tague, a second of which hit the chrome strip above the windshield. The third of which, however, after the driver, William Greer, pulled the limousine to the left and to a halt, hit him in the back of the head. His name was Nestor Tony Escadro, and he was supervised by George H.W. Bush, who would be arrested coming out of the book depository by a deputy sheriff, taken downtown, taken to the sheriff's department and questioned, but then released without any mugshot. He'd later be photographed standing in front of the book depository, just as Lansdale was photographed walking past the 3 tramps. The shot that hit, the shot was fired from the grassy knoll, the easiest shot that appears to have been done by Roscoe White, who was a Dallas police officer, but it would have hit Jackie. So he pulled his shot and wound up in the grass where it was picked up by a Dallas police lieutenant. Then we had the shot that hit the right temple, fired by Frank Sturgis, a soldier of fortune. This is the intersection of the triple underpass and the picket fence. There's an above-ground sewer opening. This is a shot that entered the right temple, the frangible or exploding bullet. The limousine was actually further down, right in this vicinity, not where it's marked in Dealey Plaza with an X. Then multiple shots were fired from the book depository, the opposite side from the alleged assassin's lair, from which no shots were fired, by Malcolm Mack Wallace, Lyndon Johnson's personal hitman, who had murdered a dozen people for Lyndon, including one of his own sisters, fired at John Connally in the mistaken belief that it was Ralph Yarborough, a liberal Texas senator whom LBJ despised. There was a huge argument that morning between Lyndon and JFK trying to get Connally out, but Jack overrode him on the ground that the chief executive of the state should ride with the chief executive of the United States. So there wasn't time to get the word to the assassins, and Connally was shot inadvertently, but it obscured the politics of the situation. Here you have the key to understanding the assassination, sorting out the sponsors from the facilitators, from the mechanics, The sponsors included the CIA. Jack was threatening to shatter it into 1,000 pieces. The Joint Chiefs were disillusioned because Jack had not invaded Cuba against their unanimous recommendation. He'd signed an above-ground test ban treaty with the Soviet Union against their unanimous opposition. Now he was pulling our forces out of Vietnam, where they felt a stand had to be taken against the expansion of international godless communism. Anti-Castro Cubans falsely believed Jack had betrayed them at the Bay of Pigs, and the CIA allowed that false impression to stand. Thus, they direct their hostility toward them. The mafia, Bobby was cracking down on organized crime, more indictments and convictions than ever in history. Just as Edgar had a sex dossier on the members of Congress, the mafia had one on Edgar, including photographs of him in compromising positions with his close personal friend Clyde Tolson, so that Edgar wasn't even able to acknowledge the existence of organized crime until after the Joe Valachi hearings, when it was laid out in such detail and precision it was no longer politically possible to deny. The Eastern establishment surrounding the Fed was upset because Jack had already instructed the Department of the Treasury to print United States notes, non-interest bearing currency. I remember as a young Marine Corps officer holding one of these bills in my hand, in a red embossed in print said United States note. Jack thought it was absurd that the government should be paying a consortium of private banks interest to print the currency of the United States. Texas oilmen were upset because he was threatening to abolish the oil depletion allowance, and Israel was very upset. David Ben-Gurion, who was the founder of Israel and his first prime minister, was upset because Jack did not want Israel to develop nuclear weapons. And in fact wanted an inspection of Dimona. He'd already required the World Jewish Congress, a lobbying organization, to register as a foreign agent. Ben-Gurion is reported to have resigned in disgust after telling the Mossad to take out JFK, and they lent their support, I have no doubt, but this was really a Lyndon Johnson operation. Among the new releases is fascinating stuff from that the KGB in New York City on September 16th to put out a request for information about Lyndon's character, background, personal friends, family, because they were now in possession of data purporting to indicate that he was responsible for the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Here is a further summing up of how the evidence, when you sort out the authentic from the inauthentic, how it impacts. It becomes relatively straightforward to draw appropriate inferences, since the mafia, for example, would not have been able to extend its reach into Bethesda Naval Hospital to alter x-rays under control of the Secret Service, medical officers of the U.S. Navy, or the president's personal physician. Neither pro nor anti-Castro Cubans could have substituted someone else's brain for that of JFK, even though the KGB might have had the same ability to recreate a film as the CIA. It could not have gained its possession, nor could any of these things have done by Lee Oswald, who is either incarcerated or already dead. And as I simply observe here that Lyndon Johnson was the pivot and brought together all the disparate elements. He would schmooze with the Secret Service and the White House and exploit the resentments toward JFK, because he did have many dalliances with young women in the White House and out. But he was not a great lover. Angie Dickinson, for example, said that her affair with JFK was the greatest 15 seconds of her life. Johnson was able to manipulate the situation and bring about the death of his predecessor so he could assume the presidency of the United States of America.
Okay, now what I want to do here is actually sort of circle back a bit and go back to Ole and also obviously Paladin. And I also have some points to make myself. There's a certain situation that Paladin and I have been investigating sort of together, and both have come to maybe various points of view on that. So I want to bring that up, and it involves, first of all, you've said nothing about the Dulles brothers and their role, and there is evidence to that effect. And the book by David Talbot, of course, Devil's Chessboard, which goes into that in great detail. There's also the alien connection involved with MJ-12, and I want to go down that road. And that does dovetail with a scene in the JFK movie that appears to be based on a true episode involving Fletcher Prouty and Lansdale. And Paladin, I want to bring you in on that. So we've got more things to cover here, and then we can also possibly bring in some more detail from your slides at a certain point. So don't despair on that Jim, and thank you for everything you're doing here. So Ole, I want to bring you in first on all of this, because again, you're in the latest area of the world, well, at least in relation to this sort of roundtable we're having. So what else do you want to say, given what Jim has laid out and the things that I've just highlighted as well, along these lines? Because it is true, what we're dealing with here is the perpetrators of a coup, and what I would say is a secret government that was formed actually starting in even 1930s, who eventually Truman hired a group of 12, or was at least persuaded to put together what we call MJ-12, and various players of this sort, and that these people are still involved in orchestrating things in the United States. And I'm also going to bring the whole thing down to Antarctica, believe it or not. So so let's go to you, Ole, and what you have to say.
You said a lot. I agree with most of it. We disagree a little bit about who were the shooters, the position, and so on. But I mean, that's part of the whole thing. That is also one of the things I really love about Jim, is that we have different opinions, but we learn from each other, and it's a dialogue instead of this headbanging that there's so much of in many of these circles. I think that once again, it's extremely important to identify the individuals that were part of this assassination, because they have been part of so much mayhem in the world ever since. You were mentioning the Dulles brothers. If you look at how they were, I mean, when you go back in their career, they were part of the whole funding of the Hitler war machine. The Bush family was also there, both in the creation of the First World War, at least the involvement of the USA in the First World War. Then in the Second World War, Prescott Bush was very much involved as well there. Funneling the funds to Hitler together and cooperating with the Dulles brothers. And then OSS was then turned into the CIA. And once the CIA was on the move, I mean, they haven't stopped since then. And when you look at it globally, there's so many countries that have been affected by this, where people, leaders chosen by the people have been not good for business and just boom, 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 taken out. And really, when you listen to the word the CIA, it's an agency, and I would say it's an agency for hire. It's sort of like for any business that wants a brutal enforcer, they can just hire their services, and that's how the CIA is used. It's not for national security so much as for the greed of the elite few, and how to just push this force onto other nations. So what can I say, except that they're still here, more powerful than ever. They split up in more and more subdivisions. They call themselves other stuff, but it's just the same thing. And so the alien part I know absolutely nothing of, so it's better maybe for me to leave over to alien.
Okay, well, that's really my portion rather than Paladin's. But let's bring Paladin in on this, unless you have further comments in terms of what we're talking about here, which is the perpetrators.
Are you addressing me, Carrie?
No, I was speaking to Ole.
Yeah.
Ole.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were speaking to Paladin.
No, I was saying I'll bring Paladin in on the conversation with regard to everything we're saying here next. What I am saying here is just to make sure that we get you, kind of covered, your stuff covered, anything you wanted to add to the overall story of the perpetrators and so on, with the idea that, I don't believe your eyes are sort of closing. So I just don't want to miss anything that you wanted to contribute to this this conversation. I just want to be sure that we give you the floor here and anything you want to say.
It's very kind of you. No, it's as I said before, I think the JFK assassination is one of the major major mysteries that needs to be solved, because it has affected and still affects such major areas in modern life. And where, I mean, for instance, if you see one of the key people one of the super criminal individuals in modern history, George Bush Sr., when you see how he has been using the exact same team, the key people in Operation 40, his whole career, they've been following him by his side as assassins, as also directors for the CIA in his government. Felix Rodriguez, for instance, has been there all the time for him. You got many of these other assassins also that have been involved in anything from the murder of Che Guevara, where Felix Rodriguez and David Morales was there. You have, like I said, the assassination of John Lennon, where it's the real killer was Jose Perdomo, who was the highest ranking officer of Operation 40 for 10 years. He was the doorman at the evening. It also seemed possible that another individual that we haven't mentioned before, but where Jim and I exposed to incredible serial killers that it seems like they've been taking out more or less 1,000 people. Two cousins, Clyde Forshaw and Walter Tabinski, that was also involved in the JFK assassination. There's some evidence showing that Clyde Forshaw was also part of the John Lennon assassination. But these people, like I mentioned before, they've been involved in Operation Phoenix and Operation Condor in South America. They killed Robert Smith in South Africa. There's a lot of signs showing that some of them were part of taking out Uwe Barschel in Germany, Olof Palme in Sweden. It's just like so many of them. And then you had the whole drug trafficking and the whole pedophile trafficking and organ trafficking and all of it joining together, and then financed by the Saudis and backed with the Israelis. And it's just one big mess, the whole thing. Very brutal octopus that is just trying to strangle us from all different areas. So identify the head of this octopus, and I tell you, so much will be solved. Once they stop messing with us, my God, just that will turn this world into such an amazing place.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so at this moment, I'm going to say, unless you guys, you can stay as long as you like. Ole, it's just, I'm just saying, if you feel that you have to back out at a certain point, just just wave at me or let me know, or this is your option to also do so here. It's up to you.
Just slide to the side like this.
Yeah.
Carrie, I pulled up the covers for my fourth, because Ole has a brilliant chapter in here about the role of Op 40. I mean, such differences we have are manifest here. My first three books, Assassination, Science, Murder, and Dealey Plaza, Great Zapruder Film Hoax, were even described by Vince Bugliosi in his 1,500-page tome, Reclaiming History, attempting to resurrect the Warren Commission, as the only exclusively scientific books ever published on the assassination. Here I have brought the current state of research up to date with the latest proofs about that Lee Oswald was in the doorway and that the backyard photographs were fake, using Roscoe White as a stand-in. It's really stunning stuff. But the contributors include John Costella, Judith Very Baker, Philip Nelson, Jim Mars, Richard Hook, Mike Pincher, Dennis Camino, Doug Horn, Dolly Dammegard. I just want to say, if somebody is looking for a book that puts it together, the scientific, the medical, the ballistic, the photographic, analyzes, there are over 1,000 photographs. It includes 486 frames of the Zapruder film. You're going to find it here. You're not going to find it anywhere else. And I just want to compliment Ole. I think he's completely brilliant. He does a wonderful job on so many different fronts. And it's been an immense pleasure and very rewarding for me to collaborate with him. I must add, I think Paladin is really extraordinarily knowledgeable and intelligent, and I'm very much enjoying having him as a participant here. I just want to thank you for putting the three of us together.
Okay, well, no problem. Thank you for being here. And now I do want to go over to Paladin, and you know, with at this point, because it's sort of Paladin. I do want to bring up these certain points to do with Lansdale and to do with our conversations about the scene in the JFK movie, how that is based on a realistic situation. And then I'm going to bring some of my sort of key investigation forward as well, just to widen the sort of playing field here a bit. And then we can circle back to Fetzer and get some more of his, you know, his slides and so on. So that's the game plan. So Paladin, the stage is yours if you'd like to comment.
Okay, thank you. I corresponded with Jim before we got started on this, and Jim, I misspoke. I said I had 2 of your books. I actually have 3. I had forgotten you wrote Murder in Daily Plaza. I have that one also, in addition to Assassination Science and the Zapruder film hoax, which was just fascinating. Okay, I'd love to get into the photograph of Oswald, the Algins 6, I believe, and also the shooters with Jim, but I'll go to some other issues and I'll lead you into our discussion, Carrie, that we had the other day. All right, I would use 3 main groups as the sponsors. The first group I would call the European Bloodlines. That would include the Federal Reserve and Israel. I would include MJ-12 as a second group, which means that would be the secret space program, the Black Projects. And the third group I would call the shadow government, which would be the CIA, the FBI, the Mafia, the Joint Chiefs, the anti-Castro Cubans, the oil men, the bankers, the military-industrial complex. Okay, so I would I think Jim's got the right players there. I would just offer that I think the go-ahead, as in any kind of assassination in organized crime, the okay has to come from the top, and I think MJ-12 and the Bloodlines and the shadow government are at the top. Now, Ole is exactly right about the through lines where you see the same people involved through history. You got the guys who did JFK. They're also included in Watergate. Some of them come through in Iran-Contra. I mean, you see the same names coming up over and over again. So I think Ole's point of that is very, very well taken. And of course, on the Warren Commission, we know that Gerald Ford was very instrumental in giving us the magic bullet theory. He moved the wound up to the neck from the middle of the back, which then gave our favorite senator from Pennsylvania, Arlen Specter, the opportunity to pen the fiction that's known as the magic bullet theory. Obviously, Specter was just an attorney. I forget what they were called. But anyway, he became a senator. And of course, we know that Gerald Ford became the only unelected president we ever had. So as you see, if you participate in this criminal activity, you get promoted up through the ranks. You get rewarded for that. Now, I would say, in my opinion, the Miami and the Chicago perceived assassination attempts that were thwarted. I think it was called off in Chicago, and I think JFK called off his trip to Miami. I think those were decoys. I think those were dry runs, because Oswald supposedly received his guns, both the revolver that he had when they caught him in the theater, which they tied to the Tippit murder, and the Mannlicher Carcano. Both were sent to the same P.O. box in April of '63. So I think this is at least when they started plotting for Dallas. And I think the reason they did Dallas was because it was LBJ country and he could handle everything on the ground. I don't think Miami or Chicago would have afforded that same luxury that JFK or that LBJ had with controlling Texas. The most important scene that I think in the JFK movie is the scene with Donald Sutherland when he meets Kevin Costner as Jim Garrison on the bench in front of the, what is that, the Lincoln Memorial, I think. And it's a 16-minute scene. And I've tried to find this on YouTube because I've referred a lot of people to it. It's like, if there's anything that you want to listen to out of JFK, if you're just going to listen to a little bit out of the 3 hours, listen to that 16-minute scene, because Donald Sutherland basically lays everything out for Costner as far as who's behind it, and they've done this before in other countries, which circles us back around to the shadow government. Now, Donald Sutherland plays Mr. X, who essentially is a fictional character based on Fletcher Prouty and what he knows. And it was interesting because I went back, I was trying to refer Carrie to that, and I went back and watched it. I have it DVR'd, and I watched that scene. And for the first time, I caught where Donald Sutherland says that Lansdale sent him to the South Pole. The part that I remembered and stuck in my mind from that scene was the fact that he said, I read a newspaper in New Zealand on our way back 5 hours after the assassination, and they already had all of Oswald's bio. And he said he checked the time, and he said it had only been 5 hours after the assassination. He said they couldn't have had all that information, which told me that this was an op. So when I mentioned that to Carrie in the South Pole, then that's what got her started, because Antarctica, and of course, if you want to take it from there, Carrie, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And, we can come back to you again as well. And I just want to say, as well as getting comments from the others on this sort of developing story, if you will, but we all know that, of course, Kerry, Senator Kerry, well, actually VP, he was a Secretary of State, I guess it was sent down to, during the election, was sent down to Antarctica, and that was a very strange development. Of course, I am also basing some of my comments about Antarctica on some of the information that came through on my interview with William Tompkins, and this all has to do with the question is, why send somebody like Prouty right around the time of the JFK assassination, who is a key player, as it happens, and reported, as I recall, to the Joint Chiefs at that time, and basically he is sent out of the line of fire, out of the situation. He said he tells the story on a YouTube video that we had watched, and that you can find on YouTube, and I can send it around if people need the link. But Prouty is doing an interview, and he's talking about how he met Lansdale, General Lansdale, in the halls of the Pentagon, I believe he said, and that suddenly Lansdale told him that, oh, by the way, they wanted to send him right away down to Antarctica so that he could deal with the nuclear situation. And I think it was the idea that he was going to be involved in somehow something to do with the nuclear plant, which we know, if you investigate, that there was a nuclear plant built and opened between, I believe it was 1960 to 1963 down there. And in the story, as Prouty is relating it, he says, actually his body language indicates to me that he is deflecting. But at any rate, he says that he was very surprised that he had nothing to do in his 9 years involvement with the government and all that he had done. He knew nothing about nuclear anything, and that he was surprised by this new sort of sudden assignment that would send him to Antarctica. And he said it was sort of a nice place for a vacation. He makes a joke about that. And he says, nonetheless, he went without question, as he's following orders, right? So then we find out, if you investigate Fletcher Prouty, that, and this I know is really quite extreme, but he is selected by the Church in Scientology to be the one person to investigate the death of L. Ron Hubbard, the leader of Scientology, who is a former military man, as many people will know, and basically was an asset of some kind. I can't remember whether, I think it's the Navy. at any rate, so they selected, out of all the humans they could have selected, Fletcher Prouty to be the one guy who they would relate to. And one thing you have to know about L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology is that L. Ron Hubbard, of course, is famous for writing books about the invasion of aliens and the role of the aliens with regard to humans, etc. And so what you've got is a direct line of knowledge going to Fletcher Prouty that indicates that he wasn't just sent to anywhere, he was sent to Antarctica. Well, if you look into the investigation I did and, interview, which is 3 hours with William Tompkins, who is now passed on, but he was 93 years old, basically came forward, was sponsored by the Navy, said publicly, he reported at this time to Bobby Ray Inman, an admiral in the Navy, who, by the way, Captain Mark Richards, one of my witnesses, also says he reports to at this time, even though he's in prison. And so then you get the link up between Prouty's background, being sent to Antarctica, and the fact that the Nazis had a base down in Antarctica, going back to the 1930s, eventually, which had to do with the secret space program, etc., and that they were being helped by a race from Aldebaran, as well as what appears to be reptilians, and so on. And it's a very, extensive story, and I don't want to take this discussion off track, but I do want you to understand that if you're going to look for who's on top, then you need to look at why was Prouty sent out of the country at a key time to do something he had no relationship to, even admits this, and by Lansdale, of all people, who appeared to be very instrumental in the Kennedy assassination. So we can't ignore that link up. We also can't ignore the link up, again, from basically our Kerry, John Kerry, who is sent down there during the election. What I'm tracking is, are we involved with an alien race that is basically calling the shots, and at key historical moments, people are going to be going down there, top heads of state, etc. And this, of course, has to be continued. It's a line of inquiry that has to be extended. But I'm going to say that there's this evidence to me happening during the Kennedy assassination, in my view, is no accident. And things that happened in Vietnam having to do with the Phoenix Project. And I'm reading a book right now that's talking about how the Phoenix Project was a testing ground in Vietnam for what they're actually doing with the New World Order here in the United States at this time. That evidence is coming forward as to how they sort of orchestrated, and Lansdale was instrumental in the Phoenix Project and setting it up in Vietnam. It was in some senses a social science torture program, if you want to call it that, and set up in Vietnam for tracking dissidents, etc. And that's something they're very heavily involved with in Homeland Security, etc., here in the United States at this time. So these are the links that I wanted to bring attention to. Then I want to get back to the Dulles brothers and their role. And I think if you ignore David Talbot's book, pointing out the key role of Dulles, which I have been also tracking through the space program, etc., that would be a big mistake. And I can tell you that I did track through, and I forget the full name of the book, but it's the book about Mary that's part of the JFK assassination.
Mary's Mosaic.
Yes. Well, it appears there's a little piece of information that she let slip in that Dulles actually went to, I believe it was Long Island, sometime prior to the Kennedy assassination. And he was part of a meeting of what's called the Council of Nine that goes back to Pluharic. And those are Giza intelligences, or said to be. And they basically seem to be downloading information from them, a certain group that was also part of a sort of you might call it a CIA project, or at least related to the CIA and Dulles. And that he was actually in Vietnam, in Long Island at this meeting. And so you have to wonder, why would this guy show up at a meeting where the Giza intelligences are giving information? And then you have to look at who are the Giza intelligences, and those are links to the Anunnaki really quite directly. Now, whether they're fictional or not is not the question. The question is, if there is orchestration from outside this planet, and whether or not they're stationed in Antarctica. And then I have another last piece of information, and I'll turn it over to everyone here, and that is that I have a secret source who has been to Antarctica and has told me that there is a what you might call a sort of a command and control center that is watching incoming, outgoing traffic, that there's a, telescopes and various things based in Antarctica to do this, that has to do with the so-called solar warden and alien incoming and outgoing craft. And all of this is orchestrated from a base in Antarctica, as this person has told me. This is a very credible source that I've vetted a tremendous amount of information from in the past. So this is a trail. It's a trail that's still what you might call a developing story. And so throwing all of this out there for your consideration and for the viewers as well, to begin to understand that these things do not stop with individual personalities, that goes way above personalities. And then you have to get into the role of MJ-12, which was assigned again to deal supposedly by Truman with the alien problem. And then you get the players within MJ-12, who they are and what roles they had. And then you also, Paladin left out the so-called team of 5, at least a few of which were probably part of MJ-12 at some point, or players of which were. And that gets into the role of also George Bush Sr., who is most definitely, as well as Kissinger, part of the MJ-12 lineup. And so that's it. That's my portion. Open the floor here to Paladin to talk about that gang of 5, so to speak, and then the others as well. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. If anybody's familiar with the White Hats report, we did a report that was in conjunction with Lord James's speech at the House of Lords in February of 2012, where he talked about 3 SWIFTs of 5 trillion each that were sent from the Federal Reserve in New York over to Europe and credited to a corporation. Well, it was a corporation in Europe called Pure Heart Investments. So we did a search on Pure Heart, and to make a long story short, we basically came upon the group of 5, which is purported to be the beginnings of the shadow government. That group of 5 included George Bush, Lansdale, Colby, a guy by the name of Ferrara, and Richard Armitage. In this group of 5 were basically the ones who were charged with the responsibility to start the shadow government. Bush was in the CIA at that point. Lansdale, obviously, I mean, I think there's so much proof, and I think Jim hit on this. He was the planner of the assassination. There's a lot of evidence that indicates that he was actually there in Daley Plaza. Bush is purported to be there. We've got photographs of him and maybe even Junior. So the group of 5 I'm very familiar with because we did an investigation. We have a big report to release that addresses that. And interestingly enough, what's going on in the news right now, the formation of the group of 5 and some of the funding came from none other than Saudi Arabia, 2 kings in Saudi Arabia. So it's a fascinating story. But it's interesting how Bush and Lansdale, 2 of the 5 in the group of 5, show up in Daley Plaza and have so many connections to the assassination. So I can throw that back to Jim now.
Okay, actually, I just want to say that the White Hats were supposed to release, actually a few years ago, what was called Number 48. That was going to really sort of drill down in detail and show documentation that would support what Paladin is saying. They did receive threats and were basically told to stand down, to which they basically were silenced for about, I think it was about 2 years. And then you slowly have been coming back on the scene, and Paladin. And so I just want to put that out there, that if the information they have is meaningless, then you have to look at the threats they received, and so on. And if anyone's interested, back then I did write a very long report called Black Projects Follow the Money. That was going to be part of the number 48, sort of a addendum to talk about where the Black Project money was going, how it goes there, and the background that Camelot has with witnesses documenting that information. So now over to Jim Fetzer, unless Ole has any comments right before Fetzer.
Oh, I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, Jim.
Thanks, Carrie. Very interesting stuff. To be concise, Fletcher was a straight shooter. He would never have tolerated. He would have taken one look at the assassination scenario where all the limousines were out of order. The president was put up front. He would have smelled a rat. Lansdale was his superior. Lansdale sent him out to South Africa, to Antarctica, to get him out of the way. Fletcher would have been a problem. Fletcher even diagnosed it based on the newspaper he read in South Church, New Zealand. As far as the Talbot book is concerned, in my opinion, it's a work of disinformation. Alan Dulles was, sat behind a desk smoking his pipe. Lyndon Johnson was the guy who was going to become president of the United States. Lyndon Johnson was the person who could determine what would or would not happen in the course of investigation. Yes, Dulles may have had a role in the planning, but Dulles was not the key player. There's a tremendous effort to divert attention away from Lyndon Johnson when nothing could be more obvious than that he was the central player, having forced himself on the ticket from the beginning. I can give you book after book: Madeline Duncan Brown, Barr McClellan, Billy Saul Astis. Phil Nelson has a completely sensational book about the character and life of Lyndon Johnson. You won't have to read 3 chapters. You understand this guy was completely ruthless and ambitious. He would book no opposition. He eventually wound up in his old age actually confessing to a psychiatrist about his role, and he was taken out apparently by the Secret Service in the end because nobody liked him in the end, which was a bittersweet conclusion to his career. In my opinion, there's a principle in philosophy of science known as Occam's razor, which says that the simplest explanation is preferable, but that's only if it's able to account for all of the relevant evidence. It's a simpler explanation to say a lone demented Marine got off 3 lucky shots than it is to say there was a complex conspiracy involving multiple shooters, multiple shots, and a very elaborate plan to alter the x-rays, to change the film, to substitute a brain. But the fact is, the simpler explanation is inconsistent with the available evidence. Now, in my opinion, adding an additional layer that goes beyond what we have, which is adequate to explain the available evidence, does not add any explanatory power, and therefore I, on methodological grounds, exclude it. I find it intriguing that you would conjecture this might be the case, but look at the personal characteristics of those who were involved here. I think you don't need to go any further, and therefore I would submit that we really do already know about 95 to 98% of what there is to know. I've been extremely pleased to participate here with you, with Paladin, with Ole, and I just say, it's wonderful to have an opportunity like this, Carrie, and I want to thank you for using, Project Camelot as a platform for the discussion of what actually has proven to be the pivotal event in the history of the United States.
Okay, and I appreciate that. I do want to say that actually I consider the Johnson theory to be the simpler explanation, and I don't believe Occam's razor is necessarily something meaningful. I have to say that that's very likely a certain degree of programming from the early days. But nonetheless, I would say that I'm not discounting Johnson's role by any means. I'm just putting another layer on top of all the other layers that we've got operating here. And this is a problem that humanity has had since the beginning, is figuring out how much they are responsible for and what is going on here on the planet, and how much is being actually orchestrated by some off-planet entities, of which we are in some cases possessed by, or at least some individuals appear to be, and bloodlines, etc. But I understand that your point of view is what it is, and appreciate it for what it is. So certainly Johnson has a very significant role. There's no doubt about that. I don't think you can discount, if you read the history of the Nazis, et cetera, and what all went on with Project Paperclip, et cetera, the role of Dulles either, and also Kennedy's hatred of Dulles as it happens. So we have to continue with this discussion. So at this point, what I'd like to do is, with everyone's permission, unless someone else has a comment, to circle back to some of the evidence that you were presenting before. We wanted to kind of jump ahead to allow for Ole to give his piece and to center on what we're calling the perpetrators, if you will. And certainly history has been changed. There's no doubt about it. So unless someone else, you can speak up now if you have something else to say, or we're going to turn this back over to Jim to continue his very good PowerPoint presentation.
Wow, I thought we just leapfrogged ahead, Carrie. I mean, that's fascinating. I mean,
there's nothing preventing us from circling back. I know we've been going for a long time, but I just want to make sure that we allow you to present any key evidence that you might not have had a chance. As I said, because of the time constraint, and because Ole is sitting there, eyes as closing as we see. So I just wanted to deal with that, get to the nitty gritty of the perpetrators. And like I say, if you don't want to back up, if you want to just go forward at this point, we probably would kind of close this down. I might look for some questions in the chat, but I do want to give at least you the chance to go back in case there was anything key that you felt in your PowerPoint that we should bring forward.
Well, let me just say that during the conference, we not only presented proof that the body that was being presented as JFK in the autopsy photographs of Robert Groden was not of the body of JFK. I agree with Paladin that it's unlikely that it actually turns out to have been Tippett, but I do think it was interesting that Robert Morningstar had the perceptivity to recognize that it didn't look like JFK. He was spot on when he observed that Jackie and Bobby had this conversation about whether to have an open casket, and Jackie observed it didn't even look like JFK for the reason that it wasn't JFK. But we also discovered that in terms of the backyard photographs, which Lee Oswald said to Will Fritz, the homicide detective who was interrogating him, was his face pasted on somebody else's body, that we've been able to prove. Where Jim Mars and I did a co-authored article entitled Framing the Patsy, the Case of Lee Harvey Oswald, and where we talked about the evidence. This is probably a good to call up, Carrie. If you go to 86, here, if you pick up on this, let me just make this addition. The Russians have been very interested in the development of the release of these new documents, so that in fact I was invited to come on to Russian state television. This is not Russia Today, Russian state television, with Paul Craig Roberts, who's our nation's leading public intellectual, to discuss the release. Here's one of the frames from the program they presented. This was a relatively brief. They put me through a rather interesting interrogation for about 30 minutes about what I did or did not know about the assassination. This was a relatively short program, only about 5 minutes overview, but I was glad to participate. They focused in part on the backyard photographs, which I thought was extremely interesting, because as I've just been explaining to you, Jim Mars and I had co-authored this article about Framing the Patsy, the Case of Lee Harvey Oswald, and where we had reviewed the evidence, including a lot that had come from Jack White, about how there was, the blocked chin was not Oswald's chin, that there was an insert line between the chin and the lower lip, that the fingertips of the right hand were cut off, that the newspapers could be used as an internal yardstick, and when you did that, it turned out the guy was either too short to be Lee, only about 5'6", when Lee was about 5'10", or what actually was the case, namely that they'd introduced the newspapers too large and therefore led to that distortion. Jim and I had concluded that the person who stood in for Lee Oswald had been this Dallas police officer, Roscoe White, in part because he had the block chin, because he had the height, the weight, and the build, and because he had this unusual lump on his right arm. It was from an abnormality from a bone that didn't heal right. And during the conference, I was able to show overlays, which aren't showing here, that Larry Rivera had prepared, that when you put together Roscoe White with the overlays, you can see that it most definitely was Roscoe White who was standing in for Lee. And I just say to the assembled, check out my latest blog. It's entitled JFK Bethesda Autopsy Photos, Not JFK, Oswald Framed Warren Report a Scam. Because when you put together the fact that Oswald was standing in the doorway, which we've been able to verify, therefore he could not have been a shooter, much less a lone demented gunman, that he was framed using the backyard photographs where we had Roscoe White standing in, where the body that's being shown is the Bethesda autopsy photos isn't even the body of JFK. You have a complete dismantlement of the Warren Commission report. There's nothing that remains. Yes, of course, the magic bullet was a fantasy. We had the opportunity to go through that in detail. And that means, as even other experts who favored the Warren report have had to concede, if the magic bullet theory were false, then there had to be, as many as 4 to 6 shooters firing 8 to 10 rounds. And of course, that's getting very close to the case. So I just encourage everyone to continue their pursuit of this research. Ole has done a brilliant work. I reiterate, he has a wonderful chapter about Op 40 in the new book, JFK, Who, How, and Why, which I highly recommend. Where I would add that Vincent Bugliosi, if I didn't mention this already, but I may have, observed that my original 3 were the only exclusively scientific books that were published on the assassination. Well, that is continued here with the latest developing research, and I'm just extremely pleased to have this opportunity to discuss these matters with you, Carrie, with Paladin, and with Ole, whom I admire beyond words.
Okay, very nice. So, Ole, any final comments on your side of the situation?
No, I just want to say thank you as well. There's echo in my head and not there. I've been up almost 24 hours in a row now, so my brain doesn't even really work. So I just want to say thank you so much. I'm gonna pull out, and please continue. I just wish I could have supplied some more good information, but I sure have been very fond of listening to Paladin and the others, and you as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being part of this whole presentation here. And Paladin, do you have some wrap-up comments?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I've followed this from the minute that we were informed in my 2nd grade class over the loudspeaker by the principal that our president had been shot. I've been on this since then, and it's interesting to watch the evolution of all of this through 54 years because, it's, as Jim said, I mean, the Warren Commission is a joke, and that's being nice. I mean, there are so many problems with the Warren Commission, and those of us who have lived through this know the evolution of the information, that if we knew the information in 1963 that we know today about Oswald, about Ruby, about all of it, it would have been a different outcome. And when we go back to that time and we think about how many people did know all that information at the time, I think it tells us really where we are. And so we have to keep this in the spotlight. We have to keep it in the forefront because the same people, the same group who did this are continuing to, control our world. The deep state, the shadow government, they're still in control. You can start with the JFK assassination, all the other assassinations in the 60s, Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11. Sandy Hook, all these things that have gone on. It's been by one group, and I think we have to keep that in mind. So, we all, those of us who've lived through it, those of us who know about it, we need to keep the information flowing out there, because the people who were born in the 1970s or after probably read stuff in the history books that say Oswald did it. And they don't realize what a ridiculous document that the Warren Commission is, like the 9/11 Commission report that was done after 9/11. So I think, we have to remember, this is a president that was gunned down in the middle of the day in broad daylight in front of hundreds of witnesses. 48 hours later, his assassin, who, is the lone nut theory there working, was gunned down in the police station while he was in police custody. Now, are we talking about an episode of the Twilight Zone or what? This is totally ridiculous. So we have to keep that in mind. We have to keep it going, because it's our job. I think we may have failed as a generation to do something about it while we had the chance. So, it's unfortunate that Jim Marrs isn't with us. I spoke to Jim on the phone a couple of times. I never got to meet him, but, I think we got to dedicate ourselves to this for Jim Marrs. And also, I want to do a shout out, and, Jim, maybe you can pass this message on to Judith Ferry Baker. She's a hero. She's got a lot of guts. She's got a lot of courage for coming out, giving us all the information that she has. She's a hero in my book. And it's interesting, as you go through this over the years, you have, it's like putting a puzzle together. And at some point in time, you realize you don't have all the pieces. And when she came out, there were two things that validated what she was and what she was saying, and her experience with Oswald in New Orleans. One was about David Ferry and what they were doing at Ferry's apartment, because in all the books that you read, the authors talk about how they found David Ferry's apartment. It was a mess. He was the defrocked priest. He had all this stuff in his apartment. He was a weird guy, all this kind of stuff. He had the mice, all these mice. He had a laboratory. And, there was never any explanation until Judith Baker came on the scene and explained what that was all about through Dr. Oshner and trying to come up with a way to give Castro cancer. And that's the second thing. Judith was able to explain what Oswald was doing in Mexico City. He was trying to deliver the specimen to a contact down there so they could assassinate Castro. So it's very interesting, and I just wanted to recognize her. And Jim, if you can give her that, my commendation, I would appreciate it.
That'll be my great pleasure.
Okay. Well, thank you, both of you. And Ole has had to leave, obviously. So I have a few more comments, just to wrap up here myself. I do want to say that there's also the fact of the cover-up. So you've got the assassination on one hand, and then you've got the cover-up that comes after the assassination. Certainly they planned for it in advance, but the Warren Commission was headed by Alan Dulles, of course. And there's also the element that actually Michael Sala has done a lot of investigation on, but it is commonly known and been investigated in, this sort of, you might say, UFO circuit for many, many years, about the background to what JFK wanted to tell people about. And one of those things was the alien connection, obviously, and what was going on here on planet Earth, and the information that he knew. I can say that we have a witness who was on Air Force One with him, Bill Holden, who had a conversation with Kennedy that he's documented and is documented on a video interview with him in Project Camelot, if you haven't seen it already. And he talked about Kennedy and he exchanging information about the fact that the ETs were real and that there was a secret about that, a cover-up. And so again, you get Kennedy's awareness. That's just documenting the fact that he was aware of what was going on. I can tell you that Captain Mark Richards, one of my witnesses again that I mentioned, he has also said in his testimony that Kennedy was killed over his knowledge and wanting to release information pertaining to the what was going on with ETs invading planet Earth, the deals that had been made with them, the treaties, etc., and also having to do with MK Ultra and what was planned along the lines of what we've seen now and has rolled out all those years since, having to do with actually MK Ultra going into colleges, universities, and programming young people. And this gets into also, of course, the Manchurian Candidate situation that has been made famous by that movie, and that Oswald was in fact a Manchurian Candidate, as are many of the patsies that we see in false flags to this day. And so it goes. I have to say that gets into the Vegas shooting, as everyone will know, that apparently Paddock was probably one of those victims as well. And you can do a lot of investigation along those lines, also having to do with Sirhan, the death of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, etc. So it's a very deep rabbit hole, as they say, and we're attempting to put all those pieces together. It's a long story, it's a complex story, and when you bring in the off-world connection, of course, it becomes even more complex. So want to thank all of you guys for coming on the show today. Dr. Jim Fetzer, thank you so much for your tour de force and your incredible dedication to bringing the details and the information, the evidence forward, and all of your really incredible work on behalf of humanity. And Paladin, to the White Hats, to yourself as well for your dedication in this way. And of course, to Ole Dammegard, who isn't still here on the screen, but certainly, as everyone will know, I've interviewed him many, many times, including a very good interview in Prague on location in person with him. In case you haven't seen that interview, I do encourage you to do so. So any last parting remarks on either part of either of you before we close this down?
Well, just thanks for the opportunity, Carrie. You've been a very gracious hostess, and you do a terrific job. And I've been really honored to be here with Paladin and Ole. It's been wonderful.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you, Jim. I'm glad we were able to have a good transmission, having you on Skype over there. And I think that at least the slides were viewable. Certainly your books have got these slides in them as well. Do you want to give a website, address, etc.?
Well, we have the new book out on Charlottesville, books on Sandy Hook, the Boston bombing, Orlando to Dallas, the moon landing, and so forth. Go to moonrockbooks.com. And for my latest blogs, which include about at least 10 on Las Vegas, go to jamesfetzer.blogspot.com. Thanks very much, Carrie.
Okay, and thank you everyone for listening and watching. I'm sorry that we don't have time for questions from the chat. Paladin, any other parting words, or do you want to say goodnight?
No, I just want to thank you for providing this opportunity. I feel honored to be on with Ole and Jim. Jim's done stellar work over the years and continues to on every subject that comes up. So Jim, thanks for taking the time to be with us tonight. I really appreciate it. And also, Carrie, thank you for providing us this venue so we can talk about this and other subjects. It's fantastic.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, thanks everyone. Thanks guys, and good night. And just coming back here, we're gonna close down. I want to thank everyone for watching and listening, and we'll be back with some very interesting productions. I don't think I'm doing anything over what's in America called the Thanksgiving holiday. I'm going to take a break myself, but we'll be back the following week. And if anything really crucial happens, then of course I will broadcast because my door is always open. And I do want to say, for those of you that are following my article, that's quite important regarding the what was first established to be the missing remote viewers and the Nazca aliens and a fabulous group of guys from what they call Troika, just two guys who had promised to come forward in September on the John B. Wells show to reveal more information. They'd already gotten several things right about the Nazca aliens before Gaia ever came out and actually confirmed those things. And all of that's in my article. It's basically called The Remote Viewers, the Missing Remote Viewers Now Found, and the Nazca Aliens. I'm still on that trail. I have heard from one of the missing viewers. They're not missing. They just simply disappeared from the sort of public scene, if you will, and they never did do their update in September. Not sure why no one pursued that except me. But they're supposed to get in touch with me and tell me more details as to why they sort of disappeared off the scene and didn't report in as to what they had promised as far as more information as to they had verified for their own information, saying that the Nazca mummies, as they're called, were the aliens, are actually from off planet. They were going to investigate further as to where they were from, as I recall. And also they had claimed two other things which are crucial, and they were correct on those two other things. So it bears watching. And just for the record, I did invite Courtney and his remote viewers to further view the Nazca alien story because I think we need more eyes on this. And the information coming forward from Troika was actually groundbreaking. And it does involve what appears to be not only the aliens from other planets, but the fact that these were implanted beings turned into androids with some form of artificial intelligence, one assumes, but we don't know for sure, and what possibly may involve, obviously, the influx onto the planet Earth thousands of years ago of alien artificial intelligence. So not only are we creating our own here, but as we're going to find, and as is being found, there are obviously various artificial intelligences coming onto the planet. Here we have possible, very, very good evidence of alien artificial intelligence that came here thousands of years ago. That is groundbreaking news and very, very crucial. So again, thanks for watching. That's my update at the very end here. And please do watch this entire thing. It contains some fascinating information, and I think you won't be disappointed. So have a great night and a great holiday if you are in the US and following with the tradition. Okay, take care. Bye.